All right, my friends. Well, good evening to you. Thank you for joining us yet again. We're jumping back in talking about hypocrisy and about what it is to be a hypocrite. If you remember last week, if you were with us, we started off, Jesus does kind of this couplet where he talks about bowls or cups being cleaned on the inside versus the outside. And then he talks about tombs inside and outside. So very similar. So we decided to kind of do it in part one, part two. So if you missed last week, go back, check that one out because we talked about what does it mean for us, especially like with social media and stuff like that. So this week I wanted to specifically talk about the church. How is the church dirty on the outside but clean on the, or in the inside but clean on the outside? Well, for me, it started me thinking about movies. I love me some movies, and if you guys know anything about movie history, there's a pretty famous art form called film noir. And it's really interesting if you go back in time and you study like old movies. Film noir was really revolutionary when it came out in like the, I don't know, 30s or 40s or something like that. But because before that, whenever you would see like an authority figure, whenever you would see like a police officer or you'd see a detective or anybody like that, you just automatically trusted them. Like they were the good guys. You knew that. They were the good guys, and the banker or the lender or usually money, they were always the bad guys. Then film noir came along, and film noir kind of flipped it on its head. Like if you guys have ever heard of like the Maltese Falcon is one of my favorite old movies. Humphrey Bogart and Peter Lorre, and it's this whole thing. There's these bad guys that are hunting for this statue, this Maltese Falcon that comes from Malta, and there's a lot of like trouble going on and people are getting killed, and it's just you don't know who to trust, and the cops are in on it and all that sort of stuff like that. If you go back a little bit less far, LA Confidential. If you guys, I mean, Kevin Spacey is, you know, not the highlight anymore, but Russell Crowe, it was kind of his big first movie. Guy Pearce, if you guys know who that was. And it's another similar one from like the I think early 2000s was when LA Confidential came out, and same sort of a thing where it's like the police are like who's in on it, and like everybody's blah 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 blah. So it gets kind of this dark picture, hence noir, film noir, film dark. And just like with hypocrisy, right, is that the whole thing with film noir is the people that we're supposed to trust, the police and these authorities, those are the ones that are in on it. Those are the ones that are saying one thing, or at least they have a job that says we stand for law, we stand for justice, but then the reality is something different. It always makes me think, and I think I use this analogy a lot, is the mafia. Those of you guys that know The Godfather, again, we're sticking with movies, but the mafia, the crazy thing about the mafia is that they were all devout churchgoers. In fact, if you didn't go to church on a Sunday, you probably would not be in the mafia. You probably would get in big trouble. And how crazy it is that they'd be sitting in the church on Sunday and then murdering people on Monday. There's even clips in, there's a famous clip in The Godfather where Michael is taking communion and doing the prayer that Catholics would do in communion about, you know, the swearing off the devil and all this sort of stuff like that. Meanwhile, his goons are at the exact same moment are off shooting people. And this contradiction, like, I mean, that's what hypocrisy is. And so how do we see that? Hopefully we don't see that, but how do we see the similar sort of trends in the church today? I mean, especially in America, because I would say the American church struggles with this in a lot of ways. We'll get to that in just a second, but as we dive in, let's jump into the scripture itself, which we're talking about Matthew chapter 23. And we will start in verse 27. If you have your Bibles, you can follow along. I'll put it up on the screen either way. 27 starts with this. Woe to you, teachers of the law and Pharisees, you hypocrites! You are like whitewashed tombs, which look beautiful on the outside, but on the inside are full of the bones of the dead and everything unclean. In the same way, on the outside you appear to people as righteous, but on the inside you are full of hypocrisy and wickedness. So again, same sort of a picture that he used with the cup. If you remember about you clean the outside of the cup, but you leave the inside dirty. So the same picture that he's getting with these tombs, it's so pretty on the outside, but it's dirty on the inside. And you think about a graveyard, think about a tomb. That's the way tombs are. That's the way caskets are. Caskets are very pretty and neat and orderly on the outside, especially compared to the inside, which is a rotting dead body on the inside. So it's a much more dramatic picture, I think, than this idea of a dirty cup. But again, Jesus is pointing back to really the main point of all of his teaching. It's way more important what's inside. It's way more important what's going on in your heart than your actions. Your actions are still important. Your actions are still important. Inside is full of dirtiness. Then the outside doesn't really matter. So what does this mean for us? I saw this. There's two different ways that I think this really cuts to the bone for us. And the first one is just Christians in general. Is like, let's be honest. And even before I start, just this idea that like I've realized as we go through this series can seem kind of gloom and doom, where we're really bashing on Christians and we're talking about, but for me, I don't see it that way. I kind of see it as that like we are all hypocrites. As humans, we're hypocrites. As Christians, we're definitely hypocrites. And the only way that we can survive is by owning that. Is by admitting, hey, yes, I'm a hypocrite and I'm working on it. Because otherwise, if I say, nope, I got it all, I'm perfect, that's real hypocrisy, and that's where the real danger is. So I think as Christians, we have to be open about this and willing to talk about this. So for me, I see a couple of different ways that Christians can be like these whitewashed tombs. Really pretty on the outside, but there's death and decay and dirtiness on the inside. And one which you guys probably see, and maybe you guys don't have a whole lot of church kids outside of, you in your circle. But what will happen a lot of times, I think especially on Instagram, is that people have, I'm a good girl, or I'm a good boy, I'm a pastor's kid, or I'm this or I'm that or whatever. And so on Instagram, maybe they'll show like, oh, I'm off serving the poor, or I'm off doing this, or I'm reading my Bible, or like quoting a Bible verse, or like whatever. But on the inside, like, or in private, we know that they're, off partying, off getting drunk, off sleeping with their boyfriend, girlfriend, like whatever. And yet they have this outside image of like, oh, no, I got it. Like, I'm the good girl. I've got this. Like, I'm walking the straight and narrow, even when that's not true. And we see that too, like with adults all the time. I mean, we definitely see from a non-Christian perspective, we see people that like, oh, like the family man with the this and that and the whatever, or like the business people that really have it all together, the rich like millionaires that have it all together. But a big one that we see in Christian circles is pastors. Is the sad reality is that one, and don't get me wrong, I think it's a danger that we have somehow made pastors, and not just youth pastors, senior pastors, all kinds of pastors, we've made them professional Christians, where it's kind of like the rest of us are just learning, but this is the professional Christian. And I don't know if that goes back to like priests and like where they actually were seen as the intermediary, like, well, you have to come to me to get to Jesus. Like, I don't know if that's where it comes from, but either way, like pastors, we're just as human as anybody else. And I know one thing that I've heard a bunch is that pastors, people that are drawn to this sort of a job, a lot of times are people that love the spotlight. I mean, I love the spotlight. I have a theater background, so the fact that here I am talking like as my job, I love to a certain extent, and so I can definitely get in trouble there. And the same thing too, like there's been, countless number of pastors that I think we want to assume that they have it all together, but the reality, like far too many pastors struggle with adultery, pornography, greed. Like I know actually my pastor at my last church, he fell from ministry because he was taking money from the offering. And like that's a temptation that's still like we are just as subject to. And yet that's such a perfect picture of hypocrisy, because not only is this expectation of like, wow, the pastor's really got it all together, but is that reality is I think we take some of that on ourselves. You're right, like I do have it all together, or I need to have it all together. as opposed to that fact that I struggle just as much as everybody else. And then the third one, which I think is also a challenge, is public figures. I think far too often we see public figures in Christianity, whether it's I don't know, like famous worship pastors, authors, like the evangelists that are on TV, the people that are writing books, whatever these like Christian celebrities, which I guess are mostly like actors that are have said that they are Christians, or they would be like famous, usually like musicians or something like that. Is that same thing? Is that they talk the talk, and I mean, I think one of the classic examples, sadly, is the TV evangelists that you see that are on, you know, television doing their Jesus stuff, and then we find out that they've been stealing money. We find out that they, you know, bought a plane with the church's money, whatever, and that's like, that is hypocrisy, right? That's saying one thing and then you're living out a completely different one. So I think that's definitely a challenge, and I want to talk about that in just a sec, about how Christians being hypocrites can be such a challenge for Jesus and the church. But the second one, which I think, and we don't have enough time to fully dive in, because I think this is something that's really going, if you guys stick around for church for the next, you know, 10, 15 years, hopefully longer than that, but I think this will be a big one, is the American church. One of the biggest challenges people have said that the church is going to face is Christian nationalism. We talked about this a couple of weeks ago with the whole January 6th insurrection, and how much Christianity was tied in with that. Ultimately, Christian nationalism is the intermingling of the United States and Jesus, which on some levels is so crazy, because it's like there are way more Christians not in the United States than there are Christians inside the United States. But as American Christians, there's a certain level of like, well, we're the real church, or we're the real whatever it is. And I think some of the problem with that, one of the fundamental problems with that, is viewing the United States then as a Christian nation that was founded on Christian principles, and that somehow, again, that's somehow tied into being a Christian means loving the United States, etc., etc., etc. However, I mean, just thinking about that, thinking about the United States, and I mean, thinking for us, we are Americans and Christians. And another form of hypocrisy is the fact that we as a nation were formed around a contradiction, around hypocrisy, around the fact that, like, the first statement that we made in the Declaration of Independence, we declare that all men are created equal, even though we didn't mean if you were black, even though we didn't mean if you were a Native American, even though we didn't mean if you were a woman, and on and on and on and on. All men are created equal. We didn't really mean all men. Maybe we meant all people that we consider men, and we don't consider black people men, we don't consider women men, or like whatever, you know what I mean? There's this fundamental hypocrisy that's built into America, and that as we have intermingled the Christianity and the United States, that's come along too. There's far too much, I mean, like, because if I don't know if you guys know this, but like in the South during the Civil War and before, during slavery, they all went to church too. And those churches would talk about, they actually came up with biblical justifications for slavery and how the black people were not real humans, because it says so here in the Bible. It doesn't, but they justified that way. So we kind of have this fundamental hypocrisy that's built in to our American Christianity. And I mean, the largest one for me too is that, I mean, think about Mark 12, right? 30 through 31. Jesus says that if you understand nothing else, this is what it all boils down to. Love God and love your neighbor as yourself. He goes on, obviously, with the Good Samaritan and other places. Well, who is my neighbor? Ultimately, everyone. Everyone who is in need, everyone, your enemies, they are your neighbor. That's not who we are today. That's not who we are as Christians. It should be, but we don't see that. I mean, obviously the black community doesn't feel that way. The Native American community has not felt that way. The LGBTQ community has not felt that way. Women have not felt that way. On and on and on and on. So, what do we do with this? What do we just kind of like let our hypocrisy control us? Like, gosh, this is horrible. I'm out of here. And don't get me wrong, that's a lot of times what happens is that the many teenagers and college students and older, that's the exact place that they land. This is all hypocrisy. You guys talk a good game, but none of you actually believe it. I'm out of here. I'm going to find something real. I think that the challenge is one, and like we talked about at the beginning of this, is that we all have hypocrisy inside of us. As humans, we do. We are fundamentally and again, to survive in this world, especially in America, we have to put on a mask. If I'm going to go in to apply for a job and I'm going to be like, hey, let me tell you all the ways I struggle with sin, I'm never going to get that job. If I'm going to apply to a college, I'm not going to be like, let me show you all of my worst test scores. No. Let me show you all of the clubs that I failed in. Let me show you all of my negative characteristics. Of course not. If I'm going to go on a date, I'm not going to go on a date with somebody and be like, hey, I am a lousy human being. No, I'm going to put my best foot forward. And so, if that's true, if we have this hypocrisy in us, both as a Christian and just as a human, I think, what do we do? Because I think some of those hypocrisies we know about. Some of those things that we know, we say one thing and we do something else. But I think some of those things we don't know. Some of those things are hidden. Some of those things are the ones that are those blind spots that we might be a contradiction that we've never even thought about before. That's been the one thing, again, with the Christian nationalism that has come out with this whole racial justice discussion, is this realization of all of these things that we've just kind of taken for granted, which people from different perspectives don't see that way. People from different perspectives, different backgrounds, different races aren't being treated that same way. And a lot of people are like, I had no idea. That wasn't in my view. Those were blind spots. So how do we deal with those? Well, I'd say first off is prayer. Yes, I know that's the Jesus-y answer, but it is, if prayer is actually asking God to speak into something and then shutting up and listening to what he's got to say, then that's the first thing that we should do. God, how am I a hypocrite? How am I saying something that I don't actually, how am I outside different than I am on the inside? And the second part, which might actually come from that, is that idea of asking other people. Asking people that have a different perspective than you. And that might just be any human, because let's be honest, each of us have a slightly different perspective. Some people have a drastically different perspective, and I think that's important too. Talking to people that are different than us, I think is really, really important to expand those blind spots, open up those blind spots, and to be open to seeing them. Because that's another scary thing. Blind spots are uncomfortable. Realizing that I've been doing something unconsciously that has hurt people, no one wants to hear that. But it's really important, I think, to be willing to hear that, to open to that. The second thing I think that is so important is helping each other out. Those of you guys that remember one of Jesus's famous